Hello, everybody. How are you today? Excellent. Welcome to Brandworks. Well, this is fun to be back. This is now, I think, my fourth time speaking at Brandworks, and it's fun to do that. The last time, I think actually my first time I was at Brandworks, I talked about how integration was the new black. And now it seems like disruption is the new black. There we go. Disruption is the new black. I guess we've solved that whole integrated marketing challenge and we don't need to worry about that anymore. But it seems like today disruption is the thing that we hear the most about. Disruption, disruption, disruption. And that's what everybody's got on their mind. Either people want to be disrupting or they want to avoid being disrupted. And that seemingly is what is the challenge that is presented to both marketers, general managers, business leaders around the world today, is how to deal with this notion of disruption. But what disruption matters? Why are we caring about disruption? Right? Disruption in and by itself doesn't do anything, right? But the reason we care about disruption is because it gives us either the opportunity to drive exponential growth for ourselves or be exponentially disrupted if we're the incumbent in this particular case. Okay? But disruption alone, just the process of being disruption, doesn't allow your company, your brand, to actually reap the benefits of that disruption unless you think about it smartly from the beginning. Okay? Disruption alone does not drive exponential growth. And the goal is not necessarily disruption, the goal is growth. Right? So if we can agree that the goal is growth, then what we have to think about is how do you translate a disruption into exponential growth? And that's a big question. It's easy to disrupt. It's a lot harder to grow. And what I want to spend our time today thinking about is what are the factors, those foundational factors that lead you to go from disruption to exponential growth. Okay, that's the topic for today, because that's all what we want to care about, is we want to harness the power of disruption and not be disrupted ourselves. So I believe that there are three foundational factors that increase the likelihood that your disruption will yield exponential growth. Okay, three foundational factors. These are principles, they aren't a recipe. Okay, so you can't go back home and say, if I only do these three things, we'll drive disruption and we'll drive growth. But if these three things aren't present, I think it's going to be a lot harder for you to reap the benefits of disruption. The first is, does your disruption focus on changing the behavior of a meaningful target? Okay, and it's got to be specific. Okay, it's got to be a specific behavior. Okay, not a general behavior. It's not about driving interest in the disruption. It's about getting your consumers to do something differently. It's about getting your consumers to do something they're not doing today or to stop doing something different. And it's got to be meaningful, a meaningful size target. Getting one or two people to act differently doesn't meaningfully drive exponential growth. It's got to be a sizable group of consumers. And getting specific about the behavior, specific about what behavior you need to change, that's the barrier to adoption of that disruption, is critical. Again, it's not about interest in the disruption. If that, we'd all just measure the buzzworthiness of an idea. The second factor is picking your spots well. Okay, the world is littered with potentially disruptive ideas that went nowhere because they chose their spots poorly. They played against really strong opponents. Okay? In general, there are they call them competitive advantages for a reason. If the incumbent has a real, durable competitive advantage, then they can perhaps extend that advantage against a possible disruption. Now that should be good news for a lot of you in this room. My suspicion is more of you sit in the seat of the incumbent than sit in the seat of the disruptor today. Is that fair? Right? Is that fair? So the good news is that if you recognize what advantages you might have, it gives you an opportunity, if you act quickly enough, to be able to harness that against potential disruption in your industry. Now, if you're good enough to be able to answer the first and second question well, the third question is key to that crossing of the chasm that Marcia talked about in the first place, is can you build advantage into your disruptive business model? Can you build advantage into it? There are many, many examples of disruption that didn't yield exponential growth for the disruptor, and we'll talk about a few of those. Companies like Friendster. Remember them? How's their growth curve going? Okay? It's not enough to just be disruptive. We'll come back to Friendster in a moment. But it's not enough to just be disruptive. You've got to be disruptive in a way that advantages you. Okay? You and your business. Okay? If you don't build the advantage into your business from the get-go, or a way to create an advantage for your disruption, then you perhaps are disrupting a category, but leaving it open for everybody else. As I like to say, first mover advantage is nice and all, but it only counts if you can lock the door behind you once you get in the room. Okay? That's how first mover advantage works. And as I said, incumbents can and should assess disruption using these same questions. So ask yourself, when you're assessing the potential threat of your disruption, are they changing behavior? Do I see some patterns of behavior emerging? Okay? Do I have an advantage that I can leverage? And then, hopefully you don't get to the third question because you've leveraged that advantage by the time you get to the third question. Okay, so let's talk about these in turn. Focus on changing a behavior of a meaningful target. What do we mean by changing behavior? Marcia talked about in her opening remarks the path to purchase. Remember that path that a consumer goes through from awareness building to trial to adoption. And I think a few years ago on this stage, some of you would have seen, I talked about how my then 275-pound father bought a smart car, and that was surprising to me, somewhat surprising to me. He's since got, for the update for folks who were there, he's since got rid of the smart car and bought something slightly larger. It wasn't the size that was the problem. It was actually more to do with the fact that the car just really didn't go very fast. And he liked to drive fast. But we talked about the path to purchase that he followed, right? Where he went from becoming aware on a trip to Italy, and then he saw, the gas prices. He saw gas prices go up, so he was stimulated to investigate. He did search on the internet. He then went to a dealer to test drive the car, and eventually made his purchase there. And then he actually recommended and talked about it on the internet. Okay, that's all well and good. That's table stakes now. So that's table stakes to know his path to purchase. So it's good if you understand the path to purchase and can intervene there. That's your job as marketers today. If you're not doing that, you're going to fall behind. You need to understand where your consumers are getting information, where they're making purchase decisions, and be there for them. But that's just enough to drive core innovation, if you will. That's just enough to drive your growth of your existing products. It's hard to be disruptive on that front because your competition has access to exactly the same information. They too can research the path to purchase. They too can go talk to consumers and figure out what they're doing today. It's actually not a hard thing to go do. It makes a much bigger difference, okay, to driving disruption, okay, that will lead to exponential growth if you can change the purchase algorithm, okay? So my father had a purchase algorithm that he was going through. The smart car fit into that perfectly well. But it's a lot stronger if you want to drive exponential growth to be able to change what those paths look like, change the reason why you're buying, okay? Change what's most important, change the algorithm, okay? Let's talk about an example. Any of you visit New York City? Okay? Any of you ever hail a cab in New York City? What do you think about the experience? It's pretty sucky. By the way, if you describe, one of the signs that you might be able to be disruptive is if you describe the consumer experience as sucky. That's a fairly technical term. That's a pretty thing. But the fact of the matter is that the taxi industry worked pretty well in New York for a long, long time. Okay? People kind of said, look, I know the experience kind of sucks, but it's pretty convenient to be able to go outside, stick my hand up, get a cab in a couple minutes. Oh, except for at 4 o'clock downtown, or when it rains, or at 7:30 a.m. on the Upper West Side, wanting to go down. Except in a few pockets, the industry works reasonably well, right? But the factor that consumers were generally making their transportation decisions on in New York was speed and simplicity, right? I go downstairs, I stick up my hand, it kind of works, it's cheap enough, as opposed to a town car service, which I have to book far in advance, and costs about double the fare of a taxi. Now, that was the algorithm that consumers went through, and that was the compromise they were making, which is, do I want speed, or do I want a nice car? And when Uber came along, so how many folks here have heard of Uber? How many folks have heard? Yeah, this is now pretty common. So they came and they changed the algorithm. Had you asked consumers, do you need to know where your car is a few minutes before? It's unlikely that consumers would have said, yeah, it'd kind of be nice, but they wouldn't have. There's no path to purchase research that would have predicted that would have been the case. However, when you showed consumers that, okay, when someone got you to trial Uber, either because a friend recommended it or because it was raining and you simply couldn't get a cab, then the fact that you saw how nice it was to have that car showing on its way, it's 5 minutes away. It was fast enough. It may not have been as fast as the taxi, but it was certainly fast enough. Okay, so it was for most of the time in New York, it's under 10 minutes. In different markets, they target different times. But that reliability of knowing where your car was became a driving force in why consumers continue to choose Uber today. Okay, they changed the algorithm. My partner, Brian Quinn, who's going to speak after me, is going to talk about Uber from a different point of view, but the lesson to be learned here is if you can change the way the consumer buys in the category in a manner that benefits you, it's much more likely that you'll yield the benefit from that disruptive growth versus competition. It also helped that the taxi industry in New York was relatively fragmented and that it was very hard for a group of individual and small entrepreneurs to yield a response. And their response has predominantly been, we're going to sue the pants off you kind of stuff, which generally in the long run doesn't tend to work. When I give a talk like this, I like to crowdsource some ideas, so I posted on Facebook and asked for some ideas of how some products that were slightly ahead of their time. And one that came to the forefront was the Folgers Singles product. Anyone know about this product launch? It's kind of launched in the 90s. So this was a very interesting product, and it's a good example, I think, of not getting over the barriers, not getting over the real barriers to adoption. Okay, so launched in the 90s, Folgers Singles looked like tea bags with a little bit of ground coffee and instant coffee inside. Okay, it was a premium price for a premium product because the ground coffee made it better tasting than the regular Folgers Instant. Now the problem was that you have to have a meaningful consumer target to make it work. So what happened? Instant coffee drinkers kind of said, I don't really feel like paying the premium price because I'm kind of happy with my instant Folgers. It tastes good and I kind of like it at the price that I have. I don't want to pay the premium. Folks who preferred to brew a fresh pot of coffee kind of said, still not as good as my fresh pot of coffee, so I kind of like the fresh pot. So what ended up happening was that consumers declared that it was great for camping. Okay, not exactly a sizable segment, the coffee drinking campers. So ultimately, that wasn't what they were going for. Now, had Folgers at the time thought through, the potential markets, maybe we would have seen these more in office settings where single-serve coffee has really taken off. So this was launched prior to the onslaught of the various different single-serve coffees that we see in office buildings today. So again, it's got to change the behavior of a sizable segment. And I think an interesting spot that we could find ourselves in is looking at Google Glass, right? Google Glass is a disruption that is very buzzworthy, but it's not about the volume of conversation, it's about the volume of adoption. And I think Google Glass will be an interesting thing to see how Google then comes and renovates Google Glass to determine where and how to adopt it. Clearly, Google faced a lot of backlash and barriers from a fashion point of view, from a privacy point of view, that got in the way of the general adoption, and they'll have to address those in order to launch. I do wonder whether or not another alternative strategy they could have followed would have been to focus on a niche segment rather than a broad population. Okay, so there have been reports that the community of surgeons actually use Google Glass quite successfully during surgery to be able to record, communicate, gather data in the operating room. One plausible way that Google could relaunch is to focus on a particular market, get scale within that market, and expand from there to get over the barriers. I think the challenge that they went through was that it was a very generic, here's an idea without an application. Okay, so again, focus on driving the behavior. What's the motivating feature that a consumer will have in order to adopt your product? In the case of Google, that wasn't clear. Okay, that wasn't clear, particularly at the price point. The second point, okay, if you can choose your battles, choose them wisely. In an ideal world, you'd play against weaker opponents. This is not a competition to who can take down the biggest giant. This is a desire to make money and to grow. Okay? So when you can pick your battles, like Uber picked the taxi industry, a very good battle to pick. But how do you know when your competition is weak or strong? Well, in my mind, if they're strong, you'll see evidence that they have some form of a competitive advantage. And I hold a very high bar for what is a competitive advantage. So when people talk to me about our people being competitive advantages and our talent, I say to them, now would your people leave if the competition paid them 15 to 20% more? And if they start to think about it too long, I go, yeah, that's not a competitive advantage. It's something that you own that is durable, that you have over year, that allows you to consistently earn a return on your invested capital above your cost of capital. That's evidence of a competitive advantage. Usually it results from a barrier to entry. Okay, and if you can't see one, then you probably don't have one. Okay, so as the incumbents, I would start to assess, what is my source of advantage? What do I have? And I would put them in three categories. Supply advantages, that's something that's an input that allows you the ability to deliver your value proposition to your consumers and your customers that your competition just don't have access to. Okay? There's demand advantages on the right where your customers are somehow locked into your business, either by high search costs, switching costs, or as Marcia talked about, habits, which are very hard to break. Or in the middle, scale advantages, where you can do something at a lower cost per unit of revenue than your competition, which allows you to either reinvest the excess returns into innovation and marketing and branding and awareness building, or allows you to deliver that same value proposition at a lower price. Let's quickly talk through some examples of each so that you get the idea. Supply advantages. The nation of Saudi Arabia has access to lots of oil. Nations compete. Okay? They have more oil than anywhere else in the world. That's a supply advantage. If you're a commodities company, having access to low-cost raw materials is a great supply advantage. Also exists in the world of pharmaceuticals. Intellectual property, patents around compounds, great examples of supply advantages where they have something that they can sell and deliver for 17 years that their competition can't. Now, clearly, patents can be innovated around, but that's a hard advantage to break that allows them on that particular compound to earn, higher than their average cost of capital returns. On the demand side, let's talk about search costs for a second. Show of hands, who has had their general practitioner doctor for 5 years at least? Show of hands. At least 5 years. Okay? Keep your hand. Folks who have had it less than 5 years, put up your hands. Now, put your hands down. See, keep your hands up. Keep your hands up. Keep your hands up if you've moved in the last 5 years. Yeah, pretty much most of you. We don't switch our doctors. No one likes going around trialing different GPs. Okay, there's a high psychic search cost associated with doctors. We just don't. It's not like, I'm going to trial a new one today and see how that goes. And then, next week I've got a few appointments set up just to make sure I get the right one. You find one you like and you kind of stick with it, right? So that's an example of search costs. If there's legitimate search costs built into your business to find an alternative, that's a real form of advantage. There's also switching costs, okay? So there's been a couple of important platforms that have existed in the desktop and laptop business for the last 20 years, and very few people switch between them because for a long time, folks felt like if you wanted to go from one operating system platform to another, there was a high degree of switching costs associated with all the files that you had to transfer. Would they be backwards compatible and all of that kind of stuff? So there is one winner in that market and one market that sort of continued to be relatively small and nascent. That's changing for a variety of reasons, and we're going to talk about how that's changing in a little while. What's that? Everybody said Coke. Interesting. Okay? You have a habit that you perceive that as a Coke. There's no branding there. There's no red. There's no nothing. That's the picture of what you have as Coke. Okay? That means, as Marcia described, as you walk down the aisle, you habitually reach for the red beverage, or if you're a diet soda drinker, you habitually reach for the silver can. Hence the sort of backlash on that polar bear can that kind of looked like a Diet Coke but was really a regular Coke. But consumers have been trained with the frequency of their purchase to go and do the same thing over and over again. I showed you a picture of a brown beverage and everybody said Coke. Okay? That's the power of habit, and that's a hard thing to break. One interesting aside for a moment is that it's easier to break a habit when the context around that habit changes. So think about it. You're going down the aisle, you reach for the cereal that Marcia described. What happens if, and you just pick the brand you always pick? What happens if you're now doing it on an e-commerce site? What happens if you now change the context around that? How does that break or disrupt an advantage? The final example is an example of scale advantages. Okay, scale advantages come when you can do something at something that behaves as a fixed cost at a lower cost per unit of revenue. That's a computer chip. Who's the leading player in the computer chip market? Intel. Right. If Intel spends 10% of their revenue on R&D, and their next largest competitor also spends 10% of their revenue on R&D, who's much more likely to come up with the next greatest chip processor? Right, because R&D functions as a fixed cost, they're spending in absolute terms more dollars on R&D than their competition. Probabilistically speaking, they're much more likely to come up with the next chip. Now, clearly, we can have some black swan events that we need to take into account, but that is something that's incredibly important to take advantage of when you have scale. Okay? Now, if you're the incumbent and you have one of these, this is what not to do when disruption happens in your industry. Okay? Not the best approach. But it's amazing how many people look at potential disruptions and say, yeah, it's not important. It's not important to me. So let's talk through some examples. Anybody know this company? Okay, so what was this company? Forget about what they are today, and Brian's going to talk a little bit about how they've evolved over the years. But let's talk about what this company was in 2002. What were they? Mail order movies. So what does it take to run a mail order movie business? What do you need? What assets do you need? A warehouse. What else? The mail. Okay. What else do you need? DVDs. Okay. Those are three things. Okay. Who was their competition in 2002? Blockbuster. Okay. Did Blockbuster have access to warehouses, or were they somehow in short supply in 2002? I'm not sure. Did they? Oh, yeah, they had warehouses called stores. Did Blockbuster, could they use the U.S. Postal Service, or did Netflix strike a proprietary agreement with the U.S. Postal Service? No, they could. And did they have DVDs? The studios weren't only selling them to Netflix at the time. In fact, they already had them. Okay, so does that seem like Netflix had a disruptive idea that should have been replicable? In fact, there were lots of companies who talked about getting into the DVD by mail business, but we like to say in our business, strategy is what you do, not what you say you want to do. They didn't act. Okay? They didn't act. They didn't act fast enough. Blockbuster did eventually get into the DVD by mail business. Unfortunately, they did so after Netflix had already generated a lot of scale and momentum behind their brand. And Netflix smartly used a subscription business model to lock in the customers that they had already got. And so by the time the reaction happened, it had been too late. What could have Blockbuster done differently? That's one strategy. They could have bought them, right? And that's clearly a strategy that has been employed by a lot of incumbents. If they can't figure out how to replicate them, find them at the early stages and buy them. That would have been a perfectly plausible solution. What else could they have done? They just could have done this earlier. They presumably could have done what Netflix did earlier and actually better by leveraging the power of their stores. Okay? So I think the key lesson from this is that if you're an incumbent, don't believe that you somehow have a right to continue with your business model going forward in perpetuity. If someone's got a good idea, ruthlessly go and try to extend your advantage that you have. Blockbuster had real scale advantages. Okay, if you think about that chart, they had advantages in scale, and they also had advantages in habit. People went habitually to Blockbuster when they thought about movie rentals. Had they been able to extend that advantage into this space, we may not have had Kevin Spacey playing, the president on House of Cards today. I think another example of a good way that companies have extended advantages is how Microsoft has extended its Office suite to the tablet environment. Okay, for a long time, Microsoft had said we're going to just deliver Office over desktops and laptops, and as they start to see certain things happening, one is the growth in the desktop and laptop markets are now slower than it's been in a long time. They see a lot of growth in the tablet and mobile device markets, and they're not the leaders in that market. Okay? But what do generally people say when they used to say, can you send me a file, and I'm going to read it on my tablet? Oh, can you PDF that for me so I can read it properly? Does that strike you as a compromise that the consumer is making to be on their tablet? But they're preferring that to read on their tablet. So Microsoft sees this and says, how can we extend our advantage into the tablet world? It's not like folks are stopping using Microsoft Office in the desktop and laptop markets, so they're going to continue to create documents. Now they just made it easier for people to read them and not give them a reason to trial other potential disruptive software in the cloud. Okay, that's one example of a good of a way that an incumbent can extend their advantage onto another platform. Okay, they did not assume that their business would just exist year over year in perpetuity without it changing. Now, if you're the disruptor and you're good enough to find a behavior that you can change, okay, to pick a weak incumbent, or at least one that will willingly bury their head in the sand, okay, now the time is to think about, how do I build in the capability to create my own competitive advantage, okay? So that when we launch our disruption, it's not just about changing the behavior of everybody in the category, it's about changing the behavior and have them come to my business. That's a big difference, okay? That's a huge difference, okay? And that's why that's the foundation to be able to cross the chasm from that early adoption through to the mass market. If you can create an advantage that advantages your brand in a category that you've disrupted, that is a foundational element to being able to cross the chasm into the mass. Okay? And that's why I think it's not about being bold, okay? It's about being smart. That's an answerable question. As you're designing your disruption, figure out, what is it that I could do? Ask yourself, what is it that I could do to build in some form of demand advantage? You know, should I use a subscription model? Okay? Should I have automatic replenishment? Should I do simple things like you charge your credit card every month over time? Is it a way to build in habit? Lots of different things that you could do that enables you to build in those advantages to your business model from the start. As I said, the world is littered with lots of different examples of companies that have disrupted but not survived. Okay, so in New York, around the same time as Netflix was getting started, we also had these companies like Cosmo and Urban Fetch. Does anyone remember those? Right? They were great. You could get your video and your ice cream delivered in under an hour by some dude on a bike. Okay? Not a bad little model, except they couldn't make any money. Probably because there were two of them trying to compete against each other and spreading the market across two. But it was an interesting idea that failed. Okay? It was an interesting idea that failed, but that paved the way for such successful businesses that are a little bit more like it, say like today's Amazon or like Fresh Direct. I think a more interesting example is the comparison of the strategies employed by Friendster and Facebook. Okay? Friendster was the first, social network at some scale, but as I said, if you want the first mover advantage, you've got to lock the door behind you. Okay? What was the barrier to leaving Friendster? Not much, right? There was very few barriers to leaving Friendster. In fact, there were no barriers to just adding another social network to your cadre of social networks. What I think Facebook did very smartly as it launched was it always had scale within their target market. It always had scale. So by starting exclusively with .edu addresses, okay, focusing on that market, that meant that the network advantages that they had was that people cared about who else was in the network. Okay, it wasn't this sort of a mass of people, it was people who they cared about, so they got scale within the network. And as they expanded, they added to that advantage by giving consumers other reasons to put more stuff on Facebook, like photography. Okay, a big reason why people stay. That's where all my pictures are. And what they've done is done a mixture of add the features that seem to be interesting, like checking in. Foursquare is not really as relevant as it was a couple of years ago, but people still do check in and name their place on Facebook when they added that feature. And also, just frankly, buying, as you suggested, they bought Instagram. Okay? When Instagram looked like it was a competitive threat, they said, okay, if you can't beat them, join them, kind of thing. One final example to talk about in leveraging and driving growth is that of the Prius. which is a really interesting supply-based advantage. So when the Prius launched, okay, in the late 90s, early 2000, and around that time frame, as the hybrid market was just getting established, they had access to the hybrid synergy drive through Toyota's subsidiary ACEN, the part supplier ACEN. Okay, Toyota owned 30% of ACEN, so while they sold the synergy drive and licensed the technology to other providers, by having access to it, they got more hybrid synergy drives than the competition did. That allowed there to be more Priuses on the road in that early stage of market development, which led to, in turn, people associating Prius as the category standard in hybrid cars. So they translated a supply-based advantage into a demand-based advantage, because generally speaking, when people think about hybrid cars, even still today, the Toyota Prius is the category prototype that they think of. And that has real advantages, that has demand advantages today. As you come into a category and say, I might like to think about buying a hybrid, it's almost a guarantee that the Prius is on the list of cars that you would consider. Okay, that all, one of the important foundational factors that stemmed from was the fact that they had access to the hybrid's synergy drive in the early stages of market development. But now, the one thing I would say, that if you're successful, you're lucky enough to answer these three questions well, or good enough to answer these three questions well, and smart enough, then you can't rest on your laurels. And that's about being a constant skeptic, okay? And never make the assumption that, well, our business will continue to grow 3% in the next little while. We'll just sort of drag that column on Excel a few years. It doesn't, life doesn't work that way anymore so much. You've got to constantly be vigilant, and does my business have a reason to exist in the next 3 years? Are my consumers making compromises? How can I build in things that I'm seeing from different pockets of innovation around the world? Okay, someone is always looking to disrupt you. With Toyota, maybe it's the folks at Tesla who say, well, why do we need dealerships at all, right? Or we don't even think you should put any fuel in your car. Or maybe it's even Google with the autonomous car. Why do we have anybody driving a car? So there's lots of disruptions on the rise in all of our industries. And hopefully these three questions give you a sense of trying to determine which of them are relevant to your business versus which of them are merely interesting, okay? If they don't change the behavior of the consumers in your category, don't worry about them. Willingly bury your hands in the sand. But if you see signs, not only that they are changing behavior, but you see signs that they could, then that's the time to act, not waiting to see, well, let's wait and see if this thing works. That's usually a bad question to ask. If you see something that's got potential, it should be, let's figure out how we can trial it and put it onto our platform, okay? Pick your spots well. If you're the disruptor, don't, if you can help it, don't go up against strong incumbents, because if they do what I just said, they should be able to crush you. It makes sense. They should be able to do it if they've got a real advantage. Pick weak opponents. The taxi industry, fragmented, disorganized, have a bad consumer experience, much better spot to pick than, frankly, Blockbuster was, but that turned out slightly differently. And then build advantage into your business model right from the start. Ask yourself questions: where within my business model do I gain advantage? Where do I keep out competition? Where can I keep out competition or lock my consumers in a way that they enjoy, that they're not making compromise? So that's the presentation for today. I'd love to take your questions for the next little while. Thank you very much.
Questions for Steve? Raise your hand. Our mic team will get a mic to you. While folks are formulating, we got one over there right away.
Okay. I can hear you.
Why don't you think Blockbuster went in? And why don't you think, what holds back most people from getting in, or doing the head in the sand?
I mean, I can't speak, I don't have any insight into the specific Blockbuster, so what I will do is say what I've seen in the different companies that I've worked with over the years. I think there's a couple factors at play. One is there's a desire in organizations for reliability versus validity. And what I would say, and that's a concept that's been put forth in a bunch of different design thinking programs. And reliability is the ability to predict what's going to happen. right? So it's like, based on this research that we did of this consumer behavior, I can predict that I will earn this ROI if I invest here, okay? And there was probably no proof that this model would work, okay? So if the organization is asking for proof, okay, that something's going to work, that's a barrier to actually doing anything about it, and it's a motivator to move slow. There's also a bunch of like, you know, kind of like, well, that's really small right now, right? That's really small, but there's only a handful of steps in exponential growth to actually get to big, right? And the problem is, once you get to big and relevant, then all of a sudden you've got a competition on your hand. So I think part of it is the combination of a culture of, well, we'll wait and see what happens, and prove to me that's really going to work. I had a CEO of one of my clients that I won't say to me, well, what's the, you know, show me someone who's made my business model work in digital. And I'm like, well, if I could show you that today, it'd be too late. So I think there's a connection between the ability to prove something and the desire oftentimes from finance departments to show me the return, okay? And the other one that I'd cite is the desire to hit quarter-to-quarter earnings. It requires investment. It requires thinking ahead. I think, in general, private companies and private equity-owned companies have a much greater foundational ability to be able to make some of those bets than do public companies because of the nature. Unless the public company has done the nice thing and saying, we're not going to provide guidance anymore, which some have.
Another question. While folks are thinking of their question, oh, you got one?
Steve, I have a question regarding some of the, we all work, or many of us work into established companies, capital-intensive companies with a given culture and stage gates established. How do you handle that to trigger disruptive innovation in those, let's say, old established cultures and environments? Yeah,
I think the first most important thing that you can do is, from as an executive team, ask different questions. If your questions are always about, tell me how this is going to work, tell me what I should expect, tell me what this is going to deliver, predict to me what's the forecast in the next 5 years, those are the sort of questions that lead companies to go do analysis that is meaningless in disruptive innovation. So being able to predict the size of a market 5 years out is an impossible task. And so if you're not the senior-most executive in the room, you have to force the conversation and have the courage to say, look, I can go do that task, but it's not worth the time and effort because it's a meaningless exercise. If your leadership starts to ask questions about, how can we go and learn about this? What tests are we running? How can we do this in a short cycle, minimalist way? How do we prototype it? Those are the kinds of questions that'll get the organization thinking. And frankly, the best way to change a company's culture is change the nature of the questions that they're asking. Another great one is just, frankly, metrics. Measure more relevant things to your business. If all you're measuring are end results, then measure, things that you're learning. Ask, what did you learn this month? What's your learning plan? And if you start to see that those questions permeate through the organization, then that's a better way to drive the kind of culture that you're thinking. Save that question and ask the head of 3M when they speak, I think, because my father used to tell me a story of what they used to do. I don't know whether he was right or not, but ask that same question. I'm curious if they tell that story. Yeah.
Hi. I was just thinking, is there ever a time when a company shouldn't react to a disruptor? For instance, should Kodak have started building phones when the iPhone came along and threatened their camera business?
Well, so let me answer the first part first. I think answering that question would be about what's the relevancy, right? So do they see any potential that the disruption will change behavior in their category, okay? So that would be that's the core question of the essence that they need to bet. So by not responding, the bet that that the companies are taking is that the disruptive activity is not going to lead to material behavior changes in their consumer base, right? So that would be the bet that they're taking. And if they can comfortably say that I'm willing to take that bet, it doesn't feel like either it won't change behavior or it's not going to change the behavior of enough consumers, then don't worry about it, right? Fair enough. But don't do the I'll wait and see, okay? Make a explicit bet. We're saying we believe it's not going to happen. I think Kodak is an interesting question. Hard to know based on whatever capabilities they might have been able to bring to bear. Are you speaking specifically to the fact that we now basically use the cameras on our phones rather than cameras? I think the question is whether Kodak could have designed in mobility and shareability into early devices prior to the iPhone. I think that there is a question of which device we would all choose to carry around, and the fundamental ethnographic reason why we don't do it is because it's nice to be able to carry one device and not two devices. So even if we had a mobile camera, whether or not that would have turned into the phone is an interesting prospect. Who knows? We have time for any more, Marcia?
You could take one more question.
Okay.
I guess we're done.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Steve
much.
Goldbach, ladies and gentlemen.